CPI is a better version of Larouche-ism and U.S. Marxism. We are not Larouchists. I mean, Larouche is an influence on me, and I do quote Larouche, but Larouche broke with Marxism, right? The full Laroucheist ideology rejects Marxism. LaRouche says that climate change is not real. It's a complete government conspiracy. It's a complete fraud, hoax. I'm not convinced of that. I mean, it could be. I don't know. I'm not a scientist. I'm not ready to say that, right? I've seen enough odd weather patterns. And, I think that it is possible we could be experiencing climate change, and it could be a result of, I don't buy the climate alarmism, but I'm not ready to say what LaRouche said. Lyndon LaRouche thought Karl Marx was a British agent. He thought Mao was a British agent, that Chiang Kai-shek was better, and that Mao and the Cultural Revolution was a conspiracy from the British Empire. Lyndon LaRouche thought a lot of things that I don't accept. I do think his overall worldview and his analysis, his critique of Marxism, and his understanding of historical progress, his understanding about the Eastern establishment and big capital being the main danger, and degrowthism being a wing of their a lot of his worldview I draw heavily from, and I quote him in my books. But I wouldn't call myself a LaRoucheist because there are some pretty fundamental disagreements, right? I appreciate his love of classical music and his respect for classical culture, but at the same time, I don't share his contempt for modern music, right? And I agree. The thing with LaRouche is that there's a grain of truth in everything that they say. Right? And I remember this. When Lyndon LaRouche died, I was sitting in the RT newsroom, and there was one of my coworkers, a producer. She was reading to me Lyndon LaRouche's obituary. And in his obituary, they tried to make him sound awful. And she quoted to me things they attributed to Lyndon LaRouche. And she said, and she just read them off to me. And she would say, okay, the Beatles were a conspiracy by the British Empire to brainwash Americans. Is that true? And I said, well, there was something called the Tavistock Institute, which was a British psychological operations institute that had done studies in propaganda after World War II. And they are the ones that did all kinds of marketing research as rock and roll was getting more popular. And they went and studied, the tent revival music and the Pentecostal music. And they developed they kind of made what made rock and roll so exciting as music. They made it more potent. And there is evidence to show that there was a lot of marketing research developed by the British to try and cultivate rock and roll music to be much more hypnotic and much more, have much more of a hypnotic effect on people because they thought it was more marketable that way. And that's why they had the British invasion. And that the Tavistock Institute, which was, was like a psychological research center that had done work with intelligence, but was also doing work with private companies, developed the sound of 60s rock and roll, that classic rock sound that you get from the Beatles, Rolling Stones, Herman's Hermits, Jimi Hendrix. That was a sound that didn't just come from nowhere. There was regular rock and roll in the United States, Elvis Presley and Buddy Holly, and that in Britain, marketing researchers were trying to find out what made rock and roll so good, and they did a lot of psychological research, and they threw together like rock, the Beatles and all of that. It was the result of marketing research. Well, is that exactly what the LaRouche people say? Or they say, well, it was a big conspiracy to brainwash Americans? No, but it's a really interesting story, actually. There really is a Tavistock Institute. They really did marketing research. There's a guy named William Sargent who wrote a book called The Mind Possessed, which was all about, the hypnotic impact of music. There's a whole fascinating story there. Right? So what LaRouche says, like on the surface, it sounds crazy, but if you actually dig into it, there's a really fascinating story there. Another thing they said, the Queen of England is a drug dealer. Now, is the Queen of England literally a drug dealer? Right? Was the Queen of England, she was going out on the weekends and, busting a cap in some bitches' asses and, handing people little white powder and getting, big wads of cash? And obviously not. But is the use of drugs as a mechanism of social control, an aspect of what the British Empire has done? Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. And I mean, China was subdued with the heroin trade and the opium, trade. And, they imported drugs everywhere as a mechanisms of controlling people. Absolutely. Right. And the opium wars, for Christ's sakes. And that now the CIA has kind of taken over what the British used to do and control people with the use of narcotics. That's true, right? So, and it's like every like weird thing they throw out that LaRouche says, it sounds kind of crazy. If you dig into it, there's a really complicated, interesting story. There's a really complicated, interesting story there that no one else knows, right? And this is, I will say this, right? And this is no offense if there's anyone watching who's the LaRouche person. But the problem is, and this is a problem, I am guilty of this too, right? Everyone is guilty of this to some degree or other, but everyone who's not mainstream has this problem, right? And it's something I struggle with. It's something all of us struggle with. Is if you know something, if you know that something is true, right? If you know in your bones that something is true, and society at large doesn't acknowledge it, that's very frustrating. That's very infuriating. I discovered at a young age that communism works, and that I was lied to about that. And it was infuriating for me. And so, but when you discover that something is absolutely true, and that mainstream media and society just won't acknowledge that, the danger is that you then inflate that truth, disproportionately. And for a long time, I did that, right? And I think the example of that I'm guilty of is that when I discovered that the Soviet Union did have economic growth and did have success, right? And that I'd been lied to, and they told me that communism failed everywhere it's ever been tried, it never worked anywhere. When I discovered that was a bullshit lie, based on that, I fell into the trap of thinking, well, Stalin had it 100% right. The Stalin way of doing things was the best way to do things. We all just need to go back to what Stalin did. I mean, there's a speech I gave, you could probably find the video of, when I say the Soviet Union collapsed because it deviated from the way Stalin did things. That's wrong. And it took me going to the communist countries, talking to people in Iran and in Venezuela and in Cuba and in Nicaragua to learn that, yes, Stalin did amazing things, but by the mid-60s into the 70s, the Soviet Union was having big problems and they needed market reforms. And China had market reforms for a reason. And I fell into the trap of just because I realized that one thing was true, I kind of blew it out of proportion. And for a long time, I was a hardline ML. I was just of the belief that we don't need market reforms, that hardline Marxism, Leninism is the most pure form of communism, and that, and that if we just stick to that, everything will be perfect. No, that's not true. Right. And it's taken me a while. It's taken me really just going and visiting the communist world and learning that that's, it's one thing to recognize the huge achievements the Soviet Union had, and it did have a lot of successes, and it does work very well in the first generation, industrializing countries, electrifying countries, but it develops problems. And it took me a long time to realize that in my outrage about society telling me that communism never worked anywhere, I oversimplified things. Right? And it's much more complicated than that. Yes, communism does work, and it has been very successful. But there's a reason that China adopted market reforms, Vietnam adopted market reforms, Cuba's adopted market reforms. But it's more complicated than that. And that's usually how the world is, right? And what I see in LaRouche is that LaRouche knows that Beatles music is not just the natural development of rock and roll. It ain't. It's actually something that was dreamed up in a laboratory involving psychological research, right? That's true. Does that therefore mean that all rock and roll music is satanic mind control and you can only listen to classical music? No, but I can see why you would think that, right? If you're going around and telling people the origin story of modern rock and roll music and everyone just says, that's a crazy conspiracy theory, and you're like, no, I can prove it. Here's The Mind Possessed by William Sargent. Here's the Tavistock, and they say, shut up. That's, if you can prove it, if you can prove it, and no one listens to you, I can see how you would then fall into the trap. All right. They would misquote and misframe things LaRouche said to falsely paint him as crazy. And then his people would double down on crazy because they didn't want to look weak. That's a good way of putting it. I believe that, John. I mean, you know better than I do. You know way better than I do. But I mean, it sounds right? And it sounds like LaRouche, he knew a lot of things, and he had in-depth knowledge and understanding of things. He was a leftist. He was a Trotskyite leftist who, when the hippie counterculture new left thing started going, he said, this stinks. This stinks. I don't want anything to do with this. And so he got canceled. They all declared him a Nazi, and and he started teaching classes and saying, no, guys, this new left stuff, this is bad. Marxism is not anti-growth. This drugs and rock and roll, this is not what being a leftist is about. And he wouldn't back down on that. And so all the mainstream Marxists who were all tailing after that blackballed him and ganged up on him. And the left is a really cliquish place. There's certain people who think they own it, right? And I mean, look at what they've done to me over BreadTube, right? And it's unbelievable. Look how the Communist Party has gone after us, right? I mean, and they kind of declared war on him. And, so he became his own thing. He eventually just kind of became his own thing. But, I respect Lyndon LaRouche. I think he's a smart man. I have learned a huge amount. You don't know how many LaRouche books I have in this apartment. I have studied his stuff, but there are some of his ideas that I just plain don't accept. And I mean, there's no way around that, right? I mean, he is a big influence on me, no doubt, but he was wrong. I mean, as far as I can tell, on certain questions. Thinking that Marxism is a British conspiracy, wrong, right? Adopting Listian Friedrich List politics, wrong. Rejecting class struggle, saying that class struggle, is a British conspiracy, right? And that we should be fighting in the interest of a nation state. The Friedrich List, Henry Carey School of Economics. No, I believe in class struggle. I believe in the working class. I've never gone full LaRouche. I never have. Daniel, I consider him to be a friend of mine, and I consider the LaRouche people to be good people that are doing great work, and they are on the front lines. I mean, they're opposing World War III. They've organized demonstrations. They're raising the alarm about the Belt and Road and all of that, and I wish them the best, and I think that they're good people doing good work. And the bulk of their worldview, peace with Russia and China, build the world land bridge, historical progress, nuclear power, opposing degrowth, I agree with. That, you want to make a list of their like top 10 major points, I agree with them. But I will never, and I never will. I mean, and I've had all the time in the world. I've known them for a long time, long before Haas ever met him. I met him. I was hanging out with Daniel, and I've spent a lot of time. I've been to Daniel's house before, and I know them, right? And if I was ever going to become a full LaRouche person, I would have done it. I'm not going to do it, right? There are just certain things about their worldview I will never adopt, And, I wish them well. I would happily attend a protest that they were at or that they organized, and, I wish them well. But that's not our group. CPI is separate, and we are not a LaRoucheist organization. We are not a LaRoucheist organization. LaRouche has been an influence on our thought, I would say. And I don't discourage anyone from engaging with LaRouchean ideas, but we're not LaRoucheists, and we never will be. Right. And the LaRouche people also themselves, they don't say that there is a LaRouche-ism. So they reject the notion of that.